many of you in the audience have commented on how cool it was to have historians who don't do what we do come and walk among us and talk to us. And so if we think of you as the proverbial Martians who landed in the middle of a meeting, you all have, you probably saw stuff we didn't see. You probably heard stuff we didn't hear. You probably identified some blind spots we might have. And why don't we start there? Louis, why don't you take a shot and so you go second on this one?
Well, let me start by thanking you all for your hospitality, for your affirmation, for your interest. I almost feel like in prevent defense right now, like I've already won the game and the only thing I can do is say something stupid, you know, and lose your affection.
Try.
But this has been a very, very great experience for me, and I hope that I continue to have interactions with many of you. So, blind spots. From a historical perspective, I am very aware that medical libertarianism and distrust of the medical establishment comes from many different places on the political spectrum and from many different worldviews. And I don't mean to suggest at all that the issue I'm about to raise has been utterly neglected, but it certainly hasn't been emphasized. And I don't really have the answer about how to solve this issue, but a very large part of skepticism and distrust about establishment medicine is tied to religion and religious communities in this country. And I don't come away from here with confidence that that is part of the vocabulary of this organization. Now, maybe, you know, I am not a especially religious person myself, so I'm not coming at this from a perspective of you know, insider in another community. But I think that it is very important to think, when we think about the communities that we're establishing relationships with, to include those people for whom religion is a very important force in shaping both their worldview and their local communities.
Thanks for that. There really has not been something we've talked about and is not a community we've figured out how to create an obvious connection with. So thanks for mentioning that. And it puts me in mind of your colleague, Jill Lepore, writing a piece recently in the New Yorker where she talks about the Scopes trial, which I thought of as like, well, that's just science against religion, and they solved it, and that's the end of it. And she draws the direct connection between that and the discussion now about teaching critical race theory and parents not wanting the state to boss them around. So thanks for pointing that out. That's really helpful. Sophia, any?
I mean, it's interesting because yesterday it was framed that we had two options sitting at the table, so we could talk either about communities, BIPOC communities in particular, who'd been traditionally really marginalized by healthcare, or we could talk about sort of medical freedom communities. And of course, those are politically and sociologically very distinct groups, generally speaking, but they do share, and this comes back to this point, probably some sense of being left out, of the people for whom this world feels really alien and medicine is intimidating and or even condescending or inhospitable in various ways. So it might be interesting to think kind of, we tend to think in political categories and sociological categories, but it might be interesting to try to think about these communities in some ways together, even though they seem perhaps antithetical. So that's an interesting point. And in some ways they might overlap too, right? I mean, religious communities can run across racial and socioeconomic divides of all kinds, ethnic divides. So, yeah.
That's really helpful. So a common thread of people we have left out, who we aren't connecting with, who have a history that we're not acknowledging, have a set of characteristics or beliefs that we're not acknowledging, and that was some of what was just on the stage that that the foundation should be thinking of. So that's really helpful. Another thing you said, Sophia, in a conversation we were having was that I think you put it as other values in the equation. Could you expand a little on that? Other values coming into the equation. You were talking about being moved by Don Berwick's observation about hospital visiting.
Yeah, I think that was I who brought that up.
Okay.
I'm sure Sophie has profound things to say about that as well. But I was very, very struck by Dr. Berwick's comment about trust loss by virtue of kind of blind spots with respect to, and this is going back to Dr. Berwick's comment the first day about not permitting people to visit relatives on their deathbeds in order to prevent disease spread. And I think that another part of many people's worldview is that risk minimization and health maximization is not always the only value, and that there's other values, both secular and religious, that people bring into the equation. And I think it's very important that the medical establishment take that into account, and rather than scorn it, acknowledge it.
Well, and for those of you who haven't read Atul Gawande's Being Mortal book, that's sort of a major theme. It's like, well, what we're trying to do is keep old people safe, and there may be some other values we may need to mix into that. So that's really helpful in a cultural humility. So Sophia, I know this one was yours. You talked about metaphors.
Oh yeah. Well, I also want to just take a moment first to just thank you, but to thank really the whole room. I'm a little embarrassed being on the stage because it's I who did all the learning the last 3 days. I come to a world in which I really an outsider, and my experience of medicine is that of most people as a patient only, and family member of patients. And I've learned a tremendous amount, and I found the meeting to be, if I must confess, way more interesting than I anticipated, because I was wondering, what am I? Are they going to want to hear from me? Am I going to want to hear? But what's been so interesting for me is the way, first of all, just so many interesting people in one room. That goes maybe without saying in this setting I'm gathering. But the ways in which almost all of the conversations, in all of them, medicine seems to me deeply embedded, or healthcare and more broadly, embedded in thinking about really large and vital social questions that are larger than just medicine. I mean, we've talked about politics, we've talked about finance and economic structures, we've talked about social differences, and we've talked about culture, the way people think, the habits they have, and how all of those things shape every kind of interaction, from the micro, the one-on-one relationship, I guess, when a patient and a doctor see each other, to the space of healthcare altogether. So I've found that to be really fascinating. Maybe not surprising to the rest of you, but again, I'm the person who's done the learning here. One thing I did notice, I thought initially, are you sure you want me to come talk about democracy and truth in this room? And would it seem too far afield? But then this morning in the first panel, I noticed there was a lot of discussion, this is the thing about the metaphors, of people said repeatedly, patients, the public, wants to be heard, or they want to be seen. And I was struck that these metaphors, were, first of all, they're kind of sensory metaphors. They're about the ways people want to be recognized, not necessarily apologized to. That seems to me not always the right thing, as much as acknowledged, heard, seen, understood. And those are, of course, the very metaphors that are central to democratic theory. I mean, when people first voted, it was called giving voice, and people said, I want to be heard. And in some ways, this conversation seemed to me to be kind of reproducing the kinds of conversations that are often had around how do you strengthen democracy as a whole. not just medicine, and this kind of metaphors of sensory recognition, of communication, and of this idea of a two-way street, back to those really interesting comments in the last session about starting with hearing people, not kind of trying to get them to come to us as much as what are they saying, and can we recognize that? And so I really thought there was some sort of interesting potentials in all of that for framing the kinds of efforts that you seem to all be making in so many important and tangible ways, actionable ways, but as a larger framework that those kind of actionable efforts fit into thinking about a conversation about trust and medicine and healthcare that really was consonant with democracy as a whole.
Louis, any additional reflections on what Sophie just said?
I don't think I could beat what Sophie just said.
Oh,
I can't either, and it
or even add to it. So.
and yeah, there we go. I mean, it's so interesting because first of all, I just got chills when you said that, and I started in this position in 2013, and shortly after I started, we came under this ferocious attack where we thought we were being dramatically mischaracterized, and the first thing we thought we'd do is stand up and say, well, that's just not true what you're saying, and we said that, and that got us nowhere, and then it was kind of, well, what's going on with these folks, and a lot of it made us realize that organizationally we didn't have a way to see and hear the doctors we were overseeing, regulating. But I definitely saw echoes of what happened with the attack on ABIM and the foundation with what happened politically in the country in 2016 of all of a sudden there were a whole lot of people who were saying they weren't being seen and they weren't being heard, and it was a kind of major political expression. So you're linking the sort of fundamentals of democratic theory with what we're starting to articulate as a value system for what it means to be effective in medicine. That's very powerful. That is really helpful. That is an idea I will carry away.
I was interested that, in my very rich discussions with many of you, some people took sort of a pessimistic takeaway from the historical presentation, and some an optimistic one. And it's interesting to think about how you could draw either lesson. But I will say that while self-flagellation is always a useful occupation in order to try to always make yourself better, I think one thing that I think everyone should realize is that the mistrust in the medical establishment is really tied to broader historical forces. By all means, try to overcome them, try to build bridges, try to make everything better, but you are, also part of a much broader sweep of distrust that is threatening many, many parts of our civilization all at once. So your efforts are, spectacular, but while on one hand that shows how challenging your mission is, on the other hand, it's not all your fault.
Another thing to take home, yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought most interesting and unusual, for at least for the conferences that I get stuck in a lot, and these boards reflect this, though I could imagine sort of recategorizing them into piles. Utopian, almost aspirational goals, total equity, single payer insurance. I mean, the sorts of things that everyone might aspire to, but aren't going to be items you can create between this forum and the next one, right? But I think that's so important to have really large goals, maybe even goals that you might not see realized in your lifetime, but are where the world should be going. but simultaneously to be having a second conversation about things that really can be done, and at multiple levels, systemic ones and even kind of personal ones for one's own practice. I thought that was unusual to be able to mix those two. And I could imagine resorting some of these into kind of columns almost, where you sort of said, these are things we all aspire to, and they're kind of ideals, full trust or something like that. These are some sort of more modest goals that we could work on within different kinds of time frames and with the different kinds of structures that wouldn't get us all the way there, but they might move the needle a little bit. And I think that's where the kind of hope, aspirational part comes, not from sort of giving up because the big goals are very hard to get to, but how to create small scale, maybe scalable up, reproducible models that can work towards any of those things. And I found that combination in these conversations of the really practical and the kind of utopian aspirational to be really quite inspiring.
Oh. So you both also reflected on, in different ways, on the way some of us gravitated towards structural solutions at a high level. Whichever one of you feels you want to talk about your thoughts on that, and then the other one can share thoughts on that, because they're a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wasn't expecting sort of like the macroeconomic and microeconomic proposals that I saw here. And I was very encouraged by the fact that so many of you think at that broad policy level about even tax policy and, Medicare reimbursement issues and so forth. So that is great, but I also, as an intellectual and cultural historian, am hyper aware that while economic fairness and equal distribution is a vital goal in terms of the provision of medical care, it alone will not solve the problem. That it has to do with cultures and personalities and traditions as well as that. So it's always going to be a two-column campaign. Neither one alone will restore trust in the medical profession.
That sounds right to me too, though I was really struck how often we came back to the financial and the economic and the disincentives that are economic towards some of the goals that are aspirational. And I was struck, like every citizen, I suppose, by the ways in which the economic is so central to every piece of this trust problem, from the patient level back to medical debt and other but all the way through the system, the ways in which economic pressures push people to do things that they might not do if the economic structures look different. That's true, of course, in universities where I live. That's true in journalism. It's true in almost every sector, but maybe it's particularly true in medicine because it absorbs so much of our national economic.
Well, you reminded us when we had our exchange about statistics and statisticians that the experts before the statisticians were called political economists. Is that what?
So statistics originally was called political economy, exactly, and it comes into play because it turns out you need to know how many people are out there if you want to know how you're going to collect taxes from them, for instance. You need to know if you want to improve agriculture, you better know who's producing what and how much of it. And that really gets going in the 18th century, and it accelerates all the way to our time. But it reminds us always, I think, that, and I'm, maybe another forum would have not historians up here, but somebody who knew something about economics, right? Or law professors know more than historians do, but still. And that to think about the ways all of these questions about equity and about trust and about misinformation I'm deeply committed to the idea they are cultural questions too, but they are also economic questions. And, we can't put that piece aside. And that came up over and over, though, in things like private equity. But that would be a really interesting way to tackle some of these questions too, would be thinking about, again, in the abstract and in the concrete, where economic change could make a difference in the trust piece too.
Well, you've both reminded us that there's a certain kind of privileging of ways of knowing, economics, scientific methods, statistics, that ultimately, and I think this is the part you're reminding us, become structures and tools for allocating power and allocating resources. And we want to think of them as values neutral, that they're just there. But you remind us that that they wind up being choices about how societies can solve certain kinds of problems, and they're not the only choices that we could make.
And I think it's one reason, perhaps, that, for instance, somebody from inside might make real distinctions between, say, doctors and heads of financial institutions and professors. I don't know, they're different. But from another perspective, they could all be called parts of a kind of knowledge elite and could be seen to be kind of in cahoots, rather than actually the ways we might think of those as quite different strains. The kinds of distinctions people were making between sort of for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals, I think, are probably not things that the public is widely aware of at all.
I mean, we can become very relativistic about both objective facts and morals, but just to turn it all around, one thing that scares the heck out of me going forward is the noises that Trump is making about the civil service. I can't get out of my head that moment when he took the Sharpie and changed the weather map. Yeah. There's a large portion of this country that is ready to just give up on the notion of objective collection of facts as an important basis for decision making. And I think it's very, very important going forward to fiercely defend the independence of the sort of selfless, I shouldn't say selfless, nobody's selfless, but of the career bureaucrats working in the agencies of the U.S. government, trying to give us the information we need in order to make both objectively and morally correct decisions.
Well, I think if there's one thing we've learned, it's if we can't do a better job, as Catherine Lucy put it earlier, why does it have to be knowledge elite and common people? We're people too. Mm-hmm. If we're better at being people and better at recognizing the peopleness of other folks, we'll probably do a better job being legitimate experts and stewards of the roles that we play. Well, you both have enormously deepened the whole conversation here. I know you made an impression on everybody.
Did I give up a long pass in the final?
No, I think not, Louis. I think you're gonna leave beloved by. Although you did speak a word on the stage that we'd avoided the whole time of the meeting, a political leader that I will not repeat that name. But other than that, I think it was pretty flawless, and I really want to thank Coach.